File item 11, AB4. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 4 by Assemblymember Ammiano, an act relating to state government.
Mr. Ammiano.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members. The controversial federal security program, also known as ESCOM, automatically checks the immigration background of every individual at the point of arrest by sharing fingerprint data with U.S. Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement. If there is a match in the flawed database, ICE then sends a detainer request asking localities to detain an individual for extra time. This extra time the individual is being held under an ICE detainer is purely for civil immigration reasons. The stated mission of ESCOM program is to target serious offenders. However, in California, about 70% of the over 95,000 Californians deported as of March of this year are people without criminal records, including victims of domestic violence or people charged with lesser offenses. Contrary to its stated goal, ESCOM has actually harmed public safety. Under ESCOM, many victims of crime, including survivors of domestic violence, are fearful of cooperating with local enforcement. A recent study by the University of California at Illinois of Latino attitudes in major cities found that 44% of responders reported that they are less likely to contact police if they are a victim of crime for fear that they or someone they know will be asked about their immigration status. Immigrants want to live in safe communities, but when trivial issues such as selling tamales without a permit or having barking dogs, and this is authenticated, can turn into extended detention and deportation, confidence and trust between local law enforcement and immigrant communities is eroded. In his veto, the governor acknowledged that federal agents should not try to coerce local law enforcement officers into detaining people who have been picked up for minor offenses and pose no reasonable threat to their communities. Yet this continues to happen every day, and countless Californians fear they could be torn from their families. I will continue to be open with working with the governor. I am awaiting a specific proposal from his office. This version reflects our core values and that we are entitled to our day in court and that people are innocent until proven guilty, no matter what color, creed, nationality, or status. In the wake of November's historic election results, there is unprecedented momentum for immigration reform with a roadmap to citizenship. If it doesn't make sense to deport an undocumented Californian today, who could be on the road to citizenship tomorrow? California cannot afford to expend vital resources on the prolonged detention of people who pose no threat to public safety. We are all safer when we foster transparency and trust, not tear it down. I join with thousands of individuals, more than 100 community-based organizations, and faith leaders from every major faith to respectfully request your aye vote. Thank you very much.
Mr. Donnelly, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I rise in opposition to AB 4. This bill is not about restoring trust. This bill is about undermining the rule of law. Because what we're talking about are not just anyone driving down the street. We're talking about people who have been charged with a crime, who might have their fingerprints run through a database. That's really what's at stake here. That's what the federal ESCOM program does. It is an important safety net to make sure that we are able to capture people who might have fallen through the cracks who are serious criminals. And then it allows ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, to act or not act. They do have a certain amount of discretion. And we have already seen from the very top of our government, we have seen an indication that the law enforcement agents are being told not to even process or apprehend anyone, let alone deport anyone who is only charged with a minor crime. So that's already been handed down through edicts. What we're doing here is we're trying to ensure that local governments, local authorities, are not deprived of a tool. And it's a critical tool. It's an important tool. And You know, it was interesting. Yesterday, I was talking to a police officer, and he mentioned to me two things that this body passed in the past few years and the effect it has had on his job. He talked about how in the city of Los Angeles, they no longer will arrest anyone who is, or in any way interdict anyone who is operating an illegal vending operation, who is out there selling food on the streets illegally. This issue has become political. It's no longer law enforcement. And he said, you know, it's interesting. I got people who are selling coffee on the streets for $1. If you go to the local coffee shop, it's $2 or $2.50 because they have to comply with all the health regulations. They have to comply and pay all the taxes. They have to pay for a building and pay for the overhead. And by the way, they're paying taxes that support my salary. And so how can I say to that shop owner, I'm no longer going to enforce the law at this small local level, given the tremendous impact that it has? So when we dismiss the rule of law by saying, hey, it's just someone selling tamales in front of Walmart, I think we really miss the point. And the point is that if we allow the law to break down at the lowest level, eventually we will have no more rule of law. And when the rule of law completely fails, we have anarchy. And I don't think anyone in this room wants that. I think this is an important tool, and if you look at what the governor said, he was very clear. He said that this bill tied the hands of local law enforcement too much. The new iteration of this bill goes in the complete opposite direction to tying their hands even tighter. And so I believe ultimately if this bill passes off this floor and makes it to the governor in its current form, then this is a bill that will be again vetoed and should be vetoed. And I ask you to save the governor the trouble and vote no here today.
Mr. Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and regrettably I also must rise in opposition to the bill. We do hear that it only deals with ICE holds related to trivial issues, selling tamales, etc. And number one, as was just outlined, I'm not sure that is a trivial issue if indeed the underground economy is the problem that we recognize it is and that we are taking some steps in this legislature to fix. But even setting that aside, let's assume that there are trivial issues and this bill applies to them. If it only applied to them, maybe it's a defensible bill. Clearly, however, it goes much beyond that. As was just outlined by the author, a similar bill was vetoed last year. This bill does not contain the restrictions that the governor in his veto message was looking for. In fact, it goes in the other direction. But we're told, wait a minute, don't worry about that. I'm still working with the governor's office to try to get this fixed, is what we've been told. Folks, it's not our job to pass work in processes. It's not our job to kick over to the Senate bills that everybody acknowledges still need work, and that, as they stand currently, will draw the governor's veto. We ought to get it right before passing it on to the Senate. Now, we also hear that there is wide bipartisan support for making immigration reform a reality. And that, again, is absolutely true. Last week on this floor, with broad bipartisan support, we passed a resolution dealing with immigration. We know in Washington there is bipartisan efforts made to reform this country's immigration laws. This bill is not an immigration law bill. This is a piecemeal effort at fixing little problems and perhaps creating greater problems at the same time, releasing perhaps violent felons back into our communities. If this were a part of immigration reform, I'd want to see the whole package rather than pass it piecemeal. I'd want to see the fixes that we are told are coming maybe in the other house, maybe when it gets to the governor's office. And finally, since it isn't trivial and it isn't immigration reform, let's ask ourselves whether the risk of the cost is worth it. What cost can there possibly be to this bill? Well, the answer is potentially significant. We don't know the entire cost, but we do know this. If we pass this bill and ultimately somehow it gets fixed and sent to the governor's office, and ultimately the governor signs it, we will be thumbing our nose at the federal government and its immigration policy. We will be refusing to cooperate with the feds, and we know what happens because the feds hold the purse strings when we refuse to cooperate. We don't get funding. Federal sources of money dry up. That's the stick the feds have to hold over us. We are risking, with this work-in process, we are risking substantial federal dollars that are coming back to the state at a time when we desperately need it, at a time when our prison system is in disarray, at a time when we're releasing potentially violent criminals back onto the streets. Wrong way to go. Too much unanswered in a bill that isn't, by its own admission, ready yet for the governor's office. Let's fix it. Let's vote no today, and let's do it right. I urge a no vote.
Mr. Alejo.
Madam Speaker and members, I also rise in support of the Trust Act. I'm proud to be a principal co-author of this bill. And I want to thank Mr. Ammiano for fighting for his very important and humane cause and trying to reform our state's immigration detainers policies within our county jails. Over 93,000 Californians have been torn apart, their families being divided, parents being deported under this so-called secure communities federal policy. But what my previous colleague of Twin Peaks did not do, it doesn't seem like he read the bill or read the analysis, because a vast majority of those being detained and deported in the program are non-criminals, people who were never charged with any crime. No crime whatsoever. The other big majority of folks detained under this program were people charged with only minor offenses. The history of this program here in California, going back to 2008, 2009, it was always intended to detain serious offenders. And this bill still allows for that to take place. It sticks to the policy's original intent. But even in my own counties, in Monterey County, 70 to 80% of the people being deported on this policy have never had a charge or only had a minor offense placed against them. And there's thousands of families in my district, children who are losing their parents, their mothers and fathers under this policy. So it does need reform, and it's been acknowledged all over the state. The Trust Act will also help create safer neighborhoods by improving trust between immigrant communities and our law enforcement. Right now, there's been documented cases of victims of crimes, immigrant victims, who are afraid to step forward, whether they're victims or witnesses, they're afraid to step forward. And certainly there's been cases of women in domestic violence situations who are afraid to step forward and cooperate with the law enforcement because of their fear of being deported. But let's be clear, even our own state's Attorney General, Kamala Harris, Sheriff Lee Baca, who was an ardent supporter originally, but also changed his local policy at the Los Angeles County level, and even Los Angeles Police Chief Charlie Beck have all taken reforms to have this policy remain to its true intent. I want to urge the Governor Brown to sign this bill. There was some concerns addressed of some additional offenses he wanted to be included, but that's going to be included. The author is negotiating and having conversations with the governor's office. He's going to get it right in the end. But it's an important bill for California, and I urge Governor Brown to do the right thing to sign this into law.
Assemblymember Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members. I rise in support of AB 4 as a member of Public Safety Committee, as a Californian. You know, I'll start by saying I don't know about my colleagues, but I don't want to live or raise my family in a police state, a state in which any Californian is afraid of the law enforcement entities who take an oath to protect and preserve. In Public Safety Committee, I was struck by the testimony, since colleagues are going to talk about personal conversations they've had. I'll share the public testimony that took place in the Assembly Public Safety Committee. The young Asian American man, student at UC Berkeley, top of his class, going on to postgraduate training, who was mugged walking from the library late one evening to his apartment close to campus. And the fear in his face in Public Safety Committee years later, and the story he recounted about how he did not call the police when he himself was a victim of crime based on his fear around this policy, is inhumane. The story the young Latina mother shared in Public Safety Committee about having the police come to her home because of a neighbor complaint about her dogs barking too loud, and the nightmare she and her young children experienced when she was detained, arrested, and taken from their home, and the dogs never attended to. The point of law enforcement coming to her home apparently was never addressed. She, however, was removed forcefully from her home in front of her children. And I'll repeat what my colleague said, permission to read, Madam Speaker.
Without objection.
In referring to our very own floor analysis that states, ICE's own data shows that over 70% of people deported under ESCOM had no previous convictions or were accused only of minor offense. Clearly, this is a policy gone wrong. Clearly, this is a net that has been cast far too wide, and far too many California residents are being victimized and brutalized by an over-the-top law enforcement entity and policy. You only need to spend 5 minutes in Public Safety Committee to hear the testimony of the hundreds that showed up that day who had direct experience with this program to understand why the passage of AB 4 is critical. I ask for an aye vote.
Assemblymember Emmanuel Perez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Let me first start off by saying thank you so much to Mr. Ammiano for once again introducing this important piece of legislation. Members, this is about recognizing our state identity. This is about family stability. This is about making sure that when a young child that wakes up in the morning in their humble home, puts on their shoes and their clothes and goes off to school, comes back and sees their mother and their father waiting for them. Too often, especially in my district, that's not the case. We have families that are separated as a result of this program that's flawed. Can you imagine what that's like? Put yourself in that child's shoes. Can you imagine what that feels like? I'm sure it's very painful. The Secure Communities Program has had many unfortunate and detrimental effects on public safety, and as well overall in our society. You've already heard the number. We're talking about over 93,000 Californians torn from their families and deported. But we can put a stop to that. We can make a change. And on a monthly basis, we're talking about 1,000 Californians detained and deported. This bill, AB 4, brings the Secure Communities Program back in line with its stated goal of focusing on individuals with serious felony convictions. It will save significant local resources by allowing local law enforcement to focus resources and jail space on serious felons. It will also help rebuild confidence and trust between immigrant communities and local police. It will make us all safer. And I agree that this is part of a larger conversation where we're talking about comprehensive immigration reform. But the state of California should not sit back. The state of California should not just wait and see. The state of California should, as it always has, is take a lead and be an example to the rest of the nation. It's the right thing to do, folks. I just ask you to think about that scenario. Think about what it would be like if your family were torn apart and all you try to do was go to work to try to provide for your family and go back home so you can see your kids. Families have been torn apart too much. Tommy, thank you for introducing this piece of legislation. Latino Caucus supports you, and we respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Mr. Ammiano, you may close.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the supportive comments that have been made on this floor. This issue goes right to the heart of comprehensive immigration reform. We can't be saying we're going to provide a path to citizenship and then throw up obstacles to that. So every day, as I am speaking, there are people who are being arrested, people who are being detained, people who are being deported, not for any other reason but that they don't look good. They don't have the right skin color. They don't have the right clothes. And once that message gets out, then families start to feel under crisis. They withdraw their kids from school. They stop going to work. If you really want to fight the underground economy, then a path to citizenship is the way to go, not putting obstacles in the way. Secure Communities has reinvented itself time after time after time. It is an embarrassment. First, there was a memorandum of understanding that would tailor the program, and it is a program, it is optional, that would tailor it to the needs of the community and minimize racial profiling. Then they said, no, arbitrarily, cavalierly, we're not going to have that MOU anymore. So we need to stop treating people and changing the goalposts in the middle of the game. People know and deserve certitude. If they need a permit, that is one thing. But to say to them, not only do you need a permit, you're going to be detained and deported, that is over the top. That is not democracy. That is not justice. That is persecution. And I think you can talk to any number of people, particularly from the Japanese American community, about what that meant, what that program would have done to them in the 40s. In terms of the governor, things are looking good. People are concerned about the same thing they were concerned about with realignment, that certain crimes that were not considered serious or felonious would be excluded. We are open, definitely open, to rectifying that. So I ask you, please, members, to do the right thing here today. Tonight, not see a terrorist behind every bush, because if you do, you're not really going to get to the people who are causing us the most serious damage here in the United States. You're going to be wasting resources on people who are patriotic in every way, pay their taxes, work, have children, go to church. I ask you for an aye vote. Thank you.
Seeing no further questions or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 42, noes 20. Measure passes.